B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, June 5th, 2019. One of the prime centers of freewheeling capitalism and free trade has produced an estimate of the worldwide cost of Donald Trump's arbitrary trade wars with China and other countries. And it's approaching $500 billion globally. The International Monetary Fund, the drivers of disaster capitalism, issued a report in preparation for the G20 Finance Ministers Central Bank Governors meeting in Japan this weekend. And they calculated that Trump's trade wars will cut global gross domestic product by 0.3% next year. This amounts to a loss of at least $455 billion, larger than the size of South Africa's economy. And Christine Lagarde, the French woman who now runs the IMF, she said there are growing concerns over the impact of the current trade tensions. The risk is that the most recent U.S.-China tariffs could further reduce investment, productivity, and growth. The just proposed U.S. tariffs on Mexico are also of concern. These are self-inflicted wounds that must be avoided. How? By removing the recently implemented trade barriers and by avoiding further barriers in whatever form. And yesterday, the stock market rally, and that rally continued today, after the Federal Reserve and its chair, Jerome Powell, appointed by Trump, announced that they will rescue the economy from the damage that Trump is doing, if necessary. They said that they would adjust interest rates, which have been moving up, and that produced one of the first upside days on Wall Street in recent memory. Now, I'm not a big fan of Christine Lagarde or the IMF. And I will repeat for those who are listening for the very first time today that I am not a free trader. I believe that tariffs and other restrictions on trade can be helpful, that protectionism isn't always bad. But it has to be done in a rational manner. And Trump believes that he can bluff and bob and weave, and that every country is just going to submit to his will. And it shows the arrogance and ignorance that I often see emanating from our stable genius leader. So right now there's a meeting at the White House, Mike Pence and the representatives of the Mexican government led by Marcelo Ebrard, who is the foreign minister. And there are hints that there will be some face-saving agreement reached, what Trump would call a deal. But nobody knows what terms have to be met, because Trump has been irrational. He doesn't set a standard for what kind of things Mexico has to do to block migration to our southern border before he will lift these onerous tariffs, or at least the threat of them. Now, Ebrard, the Mexican foreign minister, told reporters yesterday there's an 80% chance that Trump will not impose the tariffs. And at the White House last night, economic advisor Peter, what is that guy's name? Peter Navarro, told CNN that the possibility of tariffs had prompted such rapid negotiation with Mexican leaders, it now appeared possible that the penalties will not go into effect as planned on June 10th. That's Monday. We believe that these tariffs may not have to go into effect precisely because we have the Mexicans' attention. Now, this is so offensive on so many levels. It treats Mexico as second class. And the right of white leaders in America to dictate what Mexico should do. And as I've pointed out, Mexico doesn't have full control over the factors that lead people to cross through Mexico to try to get to the United States. And we're going to talk about the unstable situation in Honduras in just a moment. Now, Peter Navarro did outline some terms. Mexico must agree to hold asylum seekers south of the U.S. border. They're already doing that. It violates U.S. and Mexican law, but who cares? Because our dictator says it's okay. They want to increase police activity to stop caravans. Mexico's been doing that. And Mexico must do more to seal off its southern border to stop Central American refugees. But there are no metrics set for this. It's just how Trump feels. And that's pretty scary. Nancy Pelosi said that Trump's use of these methods treat Mexico as an enemy. It's the wrong approach. I think this is dangerous territory. This is not the way to treat a friend, she said at a news conference. And The Guardian reports the very progress that I was alluding to a second ago. If you consider it progress from Mexico to stop people from fleeing Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, seeking safety in the United States. And The Guardian reports that migrants who had been coming through in caravans, who had been getting fair treatment from the police in Mexico, and just a few months ago were being given food and shelter by Mexican citizens. Well, the government of AMLO, that's Lopez Obrador, says that they have deported over 80,000 people to Central America since January. They have accepted 9,000 asylum seekers to hang out in Mexico while their asylum petitions are being heard in U.S. courts. That violates American law, and it is quite a concession by the nation of Mexico. Mexico has also been issuing regional visas, which allow migrants to visit several southern states in Mexico, far from the U.S. border. But migrants aren't that interested because the wages and available work are not much better in, say, Chiapas than they are south of the Mexican border. And even amid the crackdown, on Tuesday, that's yesterday, 400 people crossed the Mexican border from Guatemala using the Suchiate River, and I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Tensions have boiled over in the nearby city of Tapachula, where migrants have staged mass outbreaks from a detention center that Mexico has set up there. So I feel for AMLO and for the people of Mexico to be bullied in this manner for problems well beyond their control. It's this kind of, class punishment, group punishment that is a violation of international law. Collective punishment is what the legal term is. And to add insult to the injuries, the Department of Homeland Security has announced that they have serious budget problems. Let me correct myself. This is actually Health and Human Services. They are responsible for taking care of what are called immigrant minors, unaccompanied immigrant minors. And they run the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They claim because of funding issues, they're going to cut out English classes, recreational programs like soccer, and legal aid. Now, this is just so immoral and ridiculous. They're telling us that the average stay for an unaccompanied minor is 48 days, and under a consent decree, that is about 25 days longer than courts approve of. And so we see left and right. The Trump administration is violating American law with impunity. They created this crisis, and they do not want to resolve it because of the political games that they play. Trump's calculation is that he gets more benefit out of playing games about immigration law and a comprehensive approach. And yesterday, with 7 Republicans supporting it, the House of Representatives passed a new bill to protect the Dreamers. I fully support it. And it's valuable as a political wedge because it will force Mitch McConnell to make a choice about whether it ever sees the light of day on the Senate floor. And if it gets a vote in the Senate, it then puts Republicans on record as opposing some sort of accommodation for the Dreamers. They remain hostages to Trump's irrational approach to immigration. And unfortunately, they will remain hostages for the foreseeable future. Now to Honduras. Recall that in 2009, the early days of the Obama administration, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton played games to keep Manuel Zelaya, the legitimately elected president of Honduras, out of the country long enough for the installation of the U.S.-backed Juan Orlando Hernandez. And now his government is under increasing pressure. Public anger is boiling over. Protesters have taken to the streets, and it's teachers and doctors who went on strike back in April. Now, they believe that there have been illegal diversions, corruption, $350 million stolen from the state-run health insurance system, leading to budget cuts in the health budget. And the stolen money, some of it wound up in the 2013 re-election campaign of Hernandez, the president. And this is the level of corruption, coupled with gang violence, and the sense that it's only going to get worse because Trump has been threatening to cut the limited funding that we give to the Central American nations to try to prevent their citizens from an exodus to the United States. We put this guy in power, and then we wonder why his citizens want to exit their homeland. There are also protests in Prague, in the Czech Republic. Started 6 weeks ago as a kind of relatively contained protest after the billionaire Prime Minister Andrej Babis appointed a new justice minister who people believe will go easy on him. There are fraud charges against Babis for his business empire using funds provided by the European Union. I don't have all the details on that part of the scandal. But I've been to Prague, I've been to Wenceslas Square, and it was filled yesterday with tens of thousands of people protesting the corruption of the Babis government. There have also been protests in neighboring Slovakia. I wasn't aware of that. There is a new president elected named Zuzana Kapitova. I'll have to look into the situation in Slovakia when I get a chance. So Trump has been playing his game, the role he played on that NBC show, The Apprentice. And I have to say, I only dropped by to see that show once or twice, and I found it boring. And because Trump's so distasteful, I just was never drawn to it at all. But in his state visit to London, which is gratefully, at least there is some relief for the people because he's gone. He's now in Ireland. And he conducted his gamesmanship about who will succeed Theresa May like he was running The Apprentice again. So he talked up Boris Johnson, and yesterday I mentioned that Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage both had met with Trump. And I was wrong about Boris. Boris backed out. He did a 20-minute phone call with the stable genius, but he decided the optics of a meeting with Trump and just the picture of their, respective hairdos wouldn't help him in his effort to succeed Theresa May as the head of the Conservative Party and the next prime minister. So even some people in Britain don't want to be on The Apprentice. They, I guess, are afraid he might say, "You're fired." And the New York Times quotes Max Hastings, a historian, and he said, "In my eyes, there's a fantastic naivete among the Tory leadership. which in some degrees is historic. They have a quite extraordinary belief that if they suck up sufficiently to Trump, this administration will do them favors. And Max Hastings said he had warned Theresa May about that, but she sought Trump's favor anyway, only for him to repeatedly undercut her attempts to negotiate a Brexit deal. And Hastings added, the current crop have got this disease worse. What we're seeing here is something very unusual indeed. So then Trump went on a TV show and was interviewed by Piers Morgan. You remember that guy? He was on CNN for a few years. I always thought he was a real lightweight. And I only found out because I never watched The Apprentice that he was the winner. He was a competitor, and he was the winner of the Celebrity Apprentice in 2008. Oh, I'm glad I missed that. Anyway, trying to act like a tough interviewer, Piers Morgan asked Trump about whether he's considering military action against Iran. There's always a chance. Do I want to? No, I'd rather not. But there's always a chance. I'd much rather talk. And Mike Pompeo said he wants talks with the Iranians. But the whole aggressive approach to Iran, pulling out of the nuclear deal, imposing unilateral sanctions, trying to get other countries to follow our sanctions, why do they think that makes Iran want to talk? It only makes them want to hunker down and fight. And again, Trump has this outsized notion that worldwide, everyone should just submit to what the Donald thinks is the best way forward. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. And we go to the PayPal list here. Julie Dupree kicks in $10 a month. Thank you, Julie. Let's see who else is on the list here. Joe Clarici, he's a really solid supporter, $10 a month. Carl Howard, Columbus, Ohio. And Lyle Rubin, they each kick in $5 a month. How about you? I'd like you to. I invite you to. Visit peterbcollins.com. Click menu, click Become a Subscriber. You'll land on the sign-up page. It's easy to choose a level of support that fits your budget. $5, $10, $20 a month. The $50 annual subscription earns you a bonus gift. You choose between Dr. Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch or Vanessa Keith's 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, the blueprint for human survival on the planet. One of those books can be yours with a new annual subscription and a mailing address here in the continental U.S. Nancy Pelosi's latest dodge about impeachment? Do you know that most people think impeachment means you're out of office? They think if you get impeached, you're gone. And that's completely not true. And I may have thought that myself 50 years ago. Nancy, come on. Now, I recognize that her statement is accurate. Most people don't understand the two-stage process that the House impeaches, they indict a president, and the Senate holds a trial and decides whether to remove him. But this is just another in the long string of weak excuses about why the Democrats are not pursuing impeachment. Now, I've heard all the arguments over and over again. They have a duty to impeach this defiant, law-breaking president. He is worse than Nixon. He is worse than Clinton. By a long shot. And there's evidence in today's New York Times. They did something creative, and I encourage you to follow the link because it's an interactive article which lays out 3 articles of impeachment for Donald J. Trump. And they basically cut and paste it. They show you in animations how they pull language from Nixon obstructing justice and Clinton lying under oath. And I think it's a worthwhile exercise. So take a look and be ready if the Democrats ever get their shit together. And over at BuzzFeed, Jason Leopold has been using the Freedom of Information Act, suing the Justice Department, trying to bust through some of the redactions in the Mueller investigation report. And the government has responded basically saying, niet, niet, niet. They don't want to identify some of the Facebook groups used by Russian officials to push propaganda. It turned the tide. All that Russian disinformation just confused Americans. Didn't have anything to do with the excessive media coverage, Trump's hate-filled campaign, his dog whistles, the $80 million he spent on Facebook. Nah, none of that matters because Russia. Yeah, Russia. Kevin Gosztola is a busy young journalist, a man I have great admiration for. Two pieces that I'm noting today. At Shadowproof, his main home base, he covers the House Oversight Committee's hearing on facial recognition technology and testimony by the FBI that, gosh, we haven't really tested this stuff for accuracy. We're just rolling it out anyway. And studies show, MIT, that Amazon's facial recognition software, which is Recognition, R-E-K, Recognition, mistakenly identified pictures of women as men, darker-skinned women as men, 19% and 31% of the time, respectively. And they also submitted pictures of members of Congress to facial recognition software. It incorrectly matched 28 members of Congress, identifying them as other people who've been arrested for a crime. And one of the members mismatched is California Democrat Jimmy Gomez. He asked a representative of the FBI named Kim Del Greco about biases in the technology, and she said, well, FBI personnel are not trained on the potential inaccuracies of facial recognition algorithms. But they're using it anyway. And I learned yesterday that the city of San Francisco's ban on the use of facial recognition software by the government, there's an exemption carved out for the airport, San Francisco International, SFO, saying that, well, because it's a federally controlled facility, the ban on facial recognition implementation does not apply. Gosztola also wrote a good piece that he posted at Medium. I've linked to both of these articles. It's easy to track them in the show file for my podcast today. But Gosztola makes the case on behalf of Chelsea Manning that her current incarceration for contempt, based on her refusal to testify to the WikiLeaks grand jury, is based on solid principles. And the judge who ordered her back to jail and is threatening her with big fines, Anthony Trenga, also asked her to reflect, while she has nothing to do in prison, on the principles she says that she's embracing. So she took the admonishment seriously, responded with a letter containing research she did with the help of her attorneys. Manning demonstrated her resistance is about much more than defying an investigation into WikiLeaks. It's about publicly discrediting the institution of the grand jury. In her letter, Manning contended the modern grand jury barely resembles the grand jury which the framers enshrined in the Constitution. She acknowledges her opposition comes from their use against activists, but also makes it clear she believes the institution generally undermines due process for all citizens. I am certainly not alone in thinking that the grand jury process, which at one time acted as an independent body of citizens along the lines of a civilian police review board, slowly transitioned into the unbridled arm of the police and prosecution in ways that run contrary to the grand jury's originally intended purpose. Right on, Chelsea. Quoting again, the original grand jury was more than an investigator. They were supposed to protect citizens not just from unjust indictments, but from unjust laws. In England, grand jurors who even allowed a prosecutor to come into the grand jury room were seen as having violated their oath. And in addition, she highlighted that jeopardy doesn't attach with a grand jury, which means prosecutors can repeatedly bring the same charges against individuals. So this is a really strong argument from Chelsea Manning and an excellent article from Kevin Gosztola. There's more here, and I hope you will click through and read it. Over at consortiumnews.com, editor-in-chief Joe Lauria, in a dispatch from Sydney, Australia, gives us details of a raid that occurred yesterday, but Wednesday Australian time, when cops raided the offices of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is more like the BBC than our ABC. It's a government-funded news outlet. 3 federal cops and 3 police technicians entered ABC's Sydney headquarters with a search warrant. And get this, they demanded to look through journalists' emails, and they operated under a piece of law that was enacted a few years ago that allows them to go through, delete, or change the content of these emails. And Lauria cites Winston Smith from George Orwell's 1984. His job was to rewrite news archives. And in an unrelated case, the day before, in Canberra, Australia, they entered the home of the political editor of the Murdoch-owned Daily Telegraph. Her name is Annika Smethurst. She opened her front door, maybe to get the morning paper, and found 7 cops waiting for her. And she wrote an article over a year ago that pissed off the government because it revealed that the Department of Defense and Home Affairs, they were considering new powers allowing Australians to be monitored. So this is a crackdown by the Conservative government that just got its lease renewed by the electorate. And Lauria ties it to the unrelated events, but this pattern of aggressive police attacks on the media. In France, April 20th, journalists covering the Yellow Vests were taken into custody. The raid that we've covered by the police here in San Francisco on a freelance journalist who had received a police report and then allowed it to be published. And Lauria fears that we see a pattern that is getting worse and worse. Yesterday, I mentioned that Joe Biden has released a climate change plan that kind of is a copy of the Green New Deal. And it turns out that it's even more of a copy than I suggested. In fact, it appears that draft passages, sentences were copied from other people's work. And this is a sensitive issue for Joe Biden, who was ejected from the presidential campaign in 1988 after he had plagiarized some material in a speech that he gave from a British guy. And so, first and foremost, I am going to donate to the Biden campaign quotation marks and footnote training. They're claiming that it was just a staff screw-up, that they didn't properly acknowledge the source and offer citations about where the material came from. But this is the kind of blunder that reminds us of Joe Biden's baggage, and there's more. Joe Biden, who of course was the principal sponsor of the devastating 1994 crime bill that put blacks in prison at a higher rate and for longer sentences for using crack as opposed to white guys with powder cocaine and other serious defects in that law. Well, he refuses to say that he would cut the federal prison population by any percentage. He says that's not a rational way to do it. And he tries to rewrite history, saying that he's a good guy now and that the only thing he's opposing is an arbitrary number. But Biden is also backpedaling as people figure out, with the renewed interest in abortion rights, that he has long supported the Hyde Amendment that prohibits the use of federal funds, including Medicaid, for abortion. And it disproportionately affects economically disadvantaged women and women of color. Couple of worthwhile stories published at The Intercept today. One about how big tech companies are fighting over the $10 billion contract for the Pentagon's cloud computing deal. That effort is known as JEDI, Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, and Amazon is being ganged up on and attacked by IBM, and Oracle has led a lawsuit. Microsoft is also countering them, but Oracle's lawsuit alleged conflicts of interest accusations. and it involves a revolving door for a guy named Deep Ubhi, U-B-H-I. He worked for Amazon. Then he took a job at the Department of Defense, where he was one of 4 people who was running this this auction of the cloud computing contract. And then Amazon said, hey, why don't you come back to work for us? And they dangled stock options and signing bonuses and salary numbers. And this negotiation went on for weeks while Ubhi was still a part of the committee that was devising the terms for this contract competition. So there's a serious issue there, and we'll see how that plays out. Also, we are learning that using draft legislation that came from ALEC, the dreaded American Legislative Exchange Council, that Mrs. Mitch McConnell, better known as Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, is proposing a bill written by ALEC that would criminalize pipeline protests. Now, we've seen state laws achieve that goal in large numbers. I think as many as 15 or 17 states have adopted that kind of legislation. The federal proposed law would slap a 20-year prison term on anybody who protested a pipeline or conspired to do so. So that's pretty ugly suppression of First Amendment rights. And you can bet it'll get attached to a bill and passed through the Congress. I want to recommend an article by Jonathan Katz that appeared at Mother Jones a couple of days ago. You may recall I criticized the New York Times for smearing Bernie Sanders in an article that took us back to the 1980s and his support for the Sandinista rebels in Nicaragua. And the reporters who wrote the piece showed their ignorance of the context of the Contra versus Sandinista war and the Reagan administration's illegal actions in Central America. And they tried to smear Sanders because he had attended a rally where somebody was chanting, here, there, everywhere, the Yankee will die. As if, Sanders was chanting that or cheering it or embracing that message. And Katz does a great job of taking down the false reports by the Times and the piling on by Jonathan Chait at New York Magazine. I encourage you to read Katz's new article. And he's also started posting at his own website a series of articles that he calls the long version. He's a talented reporter who has been on this podcast twice, and he helped expose the ugly actions of both Bill and Hillary Clinton in Haiti after the devastating earthquake over 10 years ago. And our final story today, I want to channel Chevy Chase when he was anchoring Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live. One of his frequent jokes was, Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. And I can advise you today that the Generalissimo is still dead, and he is still buried in the same tomb. There's a controversy in Spain. The socialist government wants to transfer his remains to another cemetery with less attention and less celebration of Franco, and they've been stymied by Franco loyalists who remain active in Spain today. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.